Oh, hello. My name is Mara and welcome to Books Like Whoa. We've got another Project Poirot video today, this time for the book After the Funeral, also known as Funerals Are Fatal, which is actually the edition that I have. That's what it's called. Let me grab that. Yeah, this is my these little leather quote-unquote editions that I've been collecting. It is called Funerals Are Fatal in that one, and actually in most of the research I was doing, it's referred to as Funerals Are Fatal, which is interesting because I've always known it as After the Funeral. So anyway, you may have heard it as either of those titles. Both I think are apt because the major event takes place after the funerals and results in something fatal. So there you go. So anyway, before we get into things, let me do my typical disclaimer in case you've never seen one of these videos before. I do not do spoilers in terms of plot. I do a synopsis that will take you up roundabouts to where we find a body, and this time that will be pretty short because it happens pretty quickly. And then I also get into kind of talking about the characters and some of their details. So if you consider that to be spoilers, consider yourself warned. My mentality is anybody who watches this who has not read the book yet would not have their enjoyment diminished, I do not think, by anything that I'm going to talk about. So that can be sort of your warning and your point of reference. But anyway, with all that said, let's get into a quick synopsis. So, After the Funeral starts after a funeral, shockingly enough. So there is a rich family, the Abernathy family, and they have a big, beautiful house, or a big, beautiful estate called Enderby. And it was built, I believe, kind of like in the Victorian era, and passed to the eldest son, who's Richard. And he's the one who inherited the business. He's been running it very successfully, but his only son prior to the book actually died very suddenly, so there's no apparent heir when Richard himself dies shortly thereafter. So he has a bunch of nieces and nephews, and he has three siblings left, or sibling spouses left, and it's sort of ambiguous as to how his estate is going to be divided. But after his funeral, they're all gathering together at Enderby to kind of hear the overview of the will. If you've ever had to deal with someone dying, you know it's a very long process, but they're hearing kind of how he's divided his estate. And there's been some kind of speculation amongst them that he was potentially thinking about picking one person to inherit the entirety of the estate and sort of administer it, because he's paid a visit recently to all of his living relatives. And let me try to get through all of them because shit, there are a lot of people in this particular book. But, okay, so he's got his only surviving brother is Timothy Abernathy, and he has a wife named Maud. And Timothy Abernathy is a pain in the ass. He's a fake invalid, and he's never been good at business. He's very complainy. Like, he is the fucking worst. I hate him in this book. His wife is very practical, but she's very defensive of Timothy. So anyway, so he visited him. He has a sister-in-law who survived his other brother, Leo, and her name is Helen Abernathy. She spends most of her time, I believe, on the island of Cyprus. That sounds right. And he's very close to her, like they were buds. Helen Abernathy is awesome. She's very practical and just like a good... Like, she's a typical Christie older woman who is just, like, solid, good morals. She reminds me a lot of the wife in Hercule Poirot's Christmas, the wife of the eldest son in that one. She's just good people. So she's survived. She's one of the people he's kind of talked to. He also has one surviving sister left, and her name is Cora. Now, she ran away from the family when she got married because they didn't approve of her husband, who is this like French painter named Pierre. And Cora is sort of what is referred to as subnormal. Like, she's kind of dim-witted. It's kind of hinted she has some sort of mental impairment. Her mother, I think, was almost 50 when she had her, and that's sort of seen as the reason. Anyway, so she's the other sibling. Then he has a bunch of nieces and nephews. So he's got the only nephew actually is George, and George is like he's a lawyer, I believe, and he's sort of scandalous, he's kind of like a rapscallion. He's not very trustworthy. He's got a niece named Rosamond, who's an actress. She's very beautiful, and she shares one trait with Cora that I'll talk about later. But she's kind of very urbane, very of the world. She reminds me a lot of the very hip niece in Dumb Witness. And she's got an actor husband named Michael. Then finally he has a niece named Suzanne, who reminds me very much of Bella in Dumb Witness. She's very practical, very devoted to her husband, who is kind of weird and crazy. He's like a pharmacist, I think, but he has this propensity for confessing to things that he didn't do to get attention. Like, he's kind of a weirdo, but she's really into him. But she is extremely practical, very, like, sharp. She probably is who, if he was going to pick one person, he should have left it to her, but essentially because she married this guy, he didn't do that. So anyway, all of that family is gathered together, and then there's a Mr. Entwistle, who is the lawyer, and he doesn't really practice that much anymore, but this was like Richard Abernathy was an old friend, and so like this is one of his last like things he's handling as a lawyer. So they all gather together, and essentially like he's kind of reading the will, and he basically what Richard Abernathy did was he decided not to just leave the entire estate to one person to keep it together, but instead to just divide it up between all of them. And that irritates Timothy because he feels like as the oldest surviving man in the family, he should get everything, but whatever. Pretty much everybody's pretty happy with this. And so they sort of are wrapping up that, and Cora says, oh, you know what, like this works out great. I'm glad that we decided to keep everything kind of quiet. And they all kind of look at her and they're like, what are you talking about? And she's like, oh, well, you know, he was murdered, but I'm glad we decided not to publicize that. And they're all like, he was not what? Because they all think he just died of natural causes, and they're like, what? And she said, oh, I'm so sorry, I shouldn't have said anything, whatever. You should know that Cora essentially is known, even though she's sort of subnormal, she is known for kind of blurting out inconvenient truths at random times. So like, she's the kind of person who like at a dinner party might look to her dinner partner and be like, you know, you've done such a good job hiding the fact that you've gained weight. Like the way you have your suit cut is great. And everyone's sort of like awkward because this person has gained weight, but it's not something you're supposed to talk about. So everybody is sort of disturbed by this outburst because she is known for being quite shrewd, but just not having any filter. So they're all kind of wondering like, was he murdered? Mr. Entwistle in particular is very disturbed by this. And this all becomes even more disturbing when I think like a day or two later, she is viciously murdered in her cottage. Like bloody, like very brutal. And like they took a couple of things, but I think they like threw them away. And it's not clear why she would be killed, except potentially that she knew who killed her brother and that person doesn't want her to say anything. So that's the framing device. And Mr. Entwistle, who's the lawyer, is so disturbed by this whole situation, he decides to go consult with Hercule Poirot and ask him to kind of help him figure out what's happening. So that's the rest of the book, is Hercule Poirot and Mr. Entwistle kind of working together to try to figure out what happened. Okay, so just initially in terms of my thoughts about this, I loved this so much on my second reading. Now, I remember liking it the first time I read it. Like, I remember really enjoying it. But I like it even more now. And I don't know if it's because, like, Mrs. McGinney's Dead was not that great, and we've kind of been up and down a lot recently, that I was just excited to get a good one. But I enjoyed the hell out of this. I felt like this is, again, Agatha Christie doing what she does best, which is, like, just having interesting characters who have interesting kind of interactions in terms of their psychology. And again, you kind of get into this whole like blood tells and family relations and like who does what, and like how like money complicates family. Like, it's a lot of themes that she does really well. And anyway, I just like this one. So before we get into the analysis, I should just say, I actually don't have a lot of analysis about this because mostly I was just like really enjoying it and having a hard time being that observant. But I do have a few things that I wanted to point out. So first of all, I kind of already mentioned a few books prior to talking to this one, but I think that this is a book very much in the same vein as something like Dumb Witness, as something like Hercule Poirot's Christmas, as something like Crooked House. Like, it has a lot of the same kind of elements to it, but mixed up in a way that is pretty different than those books, so it doesn't feel like a pure rehashing. I just wanted to note that this is a great example of a writer who has written a lot, who's finding ways to take elements of past books and recombine them in ways that are interesting, and in this case I think very, very successful. So like I said, there is a lot of kind of, I think, DNA of other books in this one, but I think it manages to be its own thing and to really kind of like take a new turn. I think that this is 100% one of those what you see isn't always the truth books, which, you know, a lot of them are, but like I think this one does that particular kind of trope that she plays with extremely well. And I just enjoyed I felt like this was a book where she kind of upped her own game, and I think that it's exciting, especially considering how up and down some of these books have been recently, to see her doing something really well. So anyway, just sort of a note of, I think that she's building on a lot of her past successes and doing something new in a way that I thought was really exciting. I do also think we have some interesting further explorations of sort of DNA and genetics and how that does or doesn't interact with somebody's abilities, accomplishments, ultimate fate in life. So for instance, Susan Abernathy, I think we're meant to see as having inherited, she's just a lot like Richard Abernathy, and she's in a very positive way, the book wants us to think, that she kind of has inherited a lot of like business sense, that she is very like competent and a woman who knows her own mind. And I think there's even some direct discussion about essentially the fact that like if she had been a man, she would have been the one who had gotten the entirety of the estate. I do also think it's interesting though that essentially what her downfall is that she chose poorly in terms of a marriage partner. And I think that's something that we see a lot of in Christie. There's a lot of women who are A, have chosen someone not that well suited for them, and B, loves that person more than that person loves them. So you definitely can think of Dumb Witness for this. You can think of something like Sad Cypress for this. And I think it's an interesting sort of gender commentary. I think Christie consistently kind of sees that as a flaw that a lot of women are prone to, especially a lot of like strong women. It seems like she does this to a lot. So it's not usually just some sort of like milquetoast, like kind of, oh, who's the wife in The Hollow? What's her face? Like Bertha, Gerald, Gertha, something like that. She's a terrible name. She's got one of those terrible old-fashioned names that you're like, who could ever be in love with somebody with that name? Gerta, that's her name, is Gerta Christie. So that is an example where the wife loves the husband more than he loves her. But in general, that's not what she does. Usually it's a woman who loves a man more than he loves her, and she's very strong. Like and actually in that same book, Henrietta loves John more than he loves her. So there's something I think that Christie must see as like that's a consistent flaw in women in general, but particularly strong women. So it's just interesting to kind of think that through. And then also just from like a genetic standpoint, things that are interesting is that Rosamond, we increasingly see throughout the book, shares her Aunt Cora's ability to say truths in a very sharp way, and in a way that's very like socially off-putting. I think the difference we're supposed to see is that Cora, her sharpness comes from a place of an intellectual difficulty, whereas Rosamond, it comes more from sort of a flouting convention perspective. And so for both of them, you know, Cora is sort of seen as like dumb or mentally impaired, but with these moments of brilliance, whereas Rosamond is sort of seen as like an airhead, frivolous person, but with these moments of insight. So again, you just see some interesting sort of like family traits that are kind of being traced through. And I guess in some ways, maybe you could look at Timothy and George in similar ways, because Timothy is definitely a very shady person in a lot of ways, and deceptive. Like he's chronically deceptive because he's chronically like pretending that he's this huge invalid when he's not. And George is also seen as someone very deceptive, and both of them essentially are also just inept at their business. So you know, I think that there's kind of a lot of cross-generational similarities that Christie is trying to play on in this book. I also wanted to highlight the fact that I think this further reinforces my sort of earlier working theory, because we've not seen it as much recently, but Christie seems to have a real like antipathy towards old people who do not have sympathy to the young, and who are always sort of like saying that things have gone to hell in the handbasket. Now that being said, she also shares some of those attitudes, but I think she doesn't necessarily have always self-awareness when she has that attitude, but when she sees it in other people, she really doesn't like it. So like Timothy is the embodiment of this. God, he was driving me crazy in this book. And not in a like he's badly written, but just like she wants you to not like him and she succeeded, because I hated that guy. But he's always kind of talking about like the way things should be or used to be or whatever. He like makes all these like political kind of commentary about like, he's obviously very conservative basically. And it's just interesting that she again is sort of revisiting that kind of theme of like part of a bad way to get old is to completely shut down to progress and completely lose your remembrance of what it's like to be young. She very much doesn't appreciate that in older generation people in her work. So I think that's fascinating. And again, I don't know that she always lived up to that ideal, but it's interesting that that's consistently her attitude. So anyway, that's really the only kind of analysis I had because I just enjoyed the hell out of this. Actually, I enjoyed this so much that I think that this is going to rocket, I believe, up into my top 5. Let's see here, top 5-ish, maybe number 6, but I put this right under Death on the Nile. I just think that this is a fantastic Christie, and I'm delighted to get such a fantastic Christie at this point in the game because we don't have all that many left. And I think that this would be a good one to start with if you're looking for a place to start with Agatha Christie. I think this could definitely be a solid place to go. And yeah, I just enjoyed the hell out of it. I would definitely recommend it. And I was delightfully surprised at how much I enjoyed it because I knew that I liked it the first time, but I liked it even better this time. And I should say that I think part of my enjoyment is that this has maybe not my very favorite, but one of my favorite David Suchet adaptations attached to it. I think it handles the reveals and everything very nicely. It doesn't materially change the plot, but the ways it does make me, they just are so funny to me and so great, and leads to the amazing line of, "But we're cousins!" Like, oh god, that was awesome. So anyway, that might be part of my affection for this, is that I do really like the David Suchet adaptation of this particular one. But anyway, I really enjoyed this one. This was a really fun reread for me. So yay, I'm glad to get a little break from some of the ones that I've not liked as much. That is definitely good. So anyway, that does it for After the Funeral / Funerals Are Fatal. Next week is Hickory Dickory Dock, which I don't remember liking that much. I haven't read it yet, but I'm not that excited for it. We'll see how it goes. But anyway, join me next week for that. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, follow me on the social medias if you're so inclined. I have all that information listed in the description box below. And I think that will do it. Hope you're having a great day, and I will talk to you later. Bye!